What is up, A-Push people? This is Mr. Winchell coming back to you with the second in our series of content-specific review videos in preparation of our 2020 A-Push exam. Today I'm going to talk you guys through period 3, a period of time which is the first period that is eligible to be tested via the DBQ. Period 3 is going to span from the French and Indian War, which takes place from 1754 to 1763, ending in the first of many treaties of Paris that we'll talk about, all the way through to 1800 with the election of Thomas Jefferson, the peaceful revolution of 1800, which ushers in period 4. So that's the frame of today's conversation as we talk our way through what's going on in this time period. I want to give you, as always, a quick look at what College Board has to say. College Board really divides period 3 into 3 blocks of content. Block 1 is the new colonial policy and what the British are trying to do to get their hands on more tax revenue, more control, more influence in the colonies from 1754 to 1776. The next chunk of content really dives into the ideological foundations for the American Revolution, and then how the Americans win their independence. And then block 3 of content really looks at what we do post-independence, how these experiments with Republican forms of government or different ways to look at representation through the Articles of Confederation, through state governments, and through the Constitution, as well as the divisive and significant issues of the Washington and Adams administrations. So that's the way it's broken down. Point 1, this tighter control by the British. Point 2, the American Revolution's ideals that have inspired new governments with different forms of government, which is really going to reference there the Articles and the Constitution. And then part 3, what the country does afterwards. I broke the unit into 6 chunks with numbers that'll be numbered throughout the video to help you guys keep track. First chunk of content, the end of salutary neglect, the end of this time period in which the British leave the colonists to their own devices to pursue their own institutions, their own societies, their own economic systems, and this new colonial policy that I often refer to as parliamentary sovereignty. The second chunk of content, the ideological and economic foundations of the American Revolution, why the colonists feel justified in declaring independence from the British. The third are the outcomes, I put in parentheses there, the S, because it's not just that the Americans become independent, but what are some of their outcomes that come with the end of the American Revolution. Fourth, we'll talk briefly about the Articles of Confederation, the structure of the Articles, the successes of the Articles, and the shortcomings of the Articles. We'll talk about what's in the Constitution and how the Constitution comes to be. And then we'll talk at the end about the Federalist period, this period of time for the first 12 years of the Constitution under the 2 terms of the Washington administration and Adams' 1 term. So that's really our look at what's happening today with our video. I look forward to having you watch it and let me know what you think. Let's begin. So really, it's important to understand that the reason this unit starts the way it does is because of this new colonial policy that comes about because of the French and Indian War, because of the British war debt, and because of this feeling in Great Britain that the colonists have gotten too big to be easily controlled. So to take a step back, before the French and Indian War, before 1763, we have this era of what's called salutary neglect, in which the British are really going to leave the colonists alone to develop their own ways, their own societies, their own institutions, their own political mechanizations, with very, very few exceptions to this rule of salutary neglect. One exception, of course, are the Navigation Acts, which are passed in the 1660s and into the 1670s, which enforce the idea of mercantilism, that the colonists should exist to produce raw materials to provide to the mother country, in this case, Great Britain, and in return buy back manufactured goods from Great Britain at an increasing cost. The idea of mercantilism is simply that colonies exist to provide for their mother country economic stability, economic resources, economic support. So for the most part, because of mercantilism, because of the Navigation Acts, what Great Britain really says is, as long as you guys are benefiting us over there economically, then we're going to kind of leave you alone. We didn't send you to the New World. You sent yourselves to the New World. You're there. Just keep sending us tobacco. Keep sending us lumber. Keep sending us our indigo. Keep sending us our stuff. Keep buying back our goods, and then we'll call it even. There's a couple other examples. The Dominion of New England is formed in the early 1700s as an attempt to try to assert a little more control over the New England colonies in particular, including New York at the time, to try to put them under one royal governor, Edmund Andros. That the reaction by the colonists to this is not good. They're not happy about this attempt at control, and the British say, "Oh, never mind, we're good. Keep doing your thing." Now, there's a couple reasons. There's a couple reasons for this policy of salutary neglect. Distance is one, right? It's incredibly hard to control a people that live this far away without a huge investment in force. That the army would have to be here, and government officials would have to be here, etc. And the British are stretched too thin in their empire to assert that much control on the colonies. The second is economic, right? The British are looking at this whole thing like, what do we care what they're doing as long as we're benefiting from it from an economic standpoint? And then by the time the British want to assert more control on the colonists, it's almost become too late. They've let the colonies develop for such a long time that the colonies have established their own character, their own identity, their own way of doing things, that once that attempt at control comes back, the reaction then is going to be incredibly negative. So while the colonies are developing on their own, they're going to develop largely without British assistance, without British control. They're going to develop very unique economies based on their region. We talked about this in the period 1 and 2 video, in that each colonial region is going to establish an economy based on the resources that are available to them and their motivations, their reasoning for colonization in the first place. We're going to see a southern economy that's built heavily on cash crops. We're going to see a middle colonies economy that's built on a diverse mixed economy of bread basket agriculture and shipping and trade in the cities. We're going to see a New England colony economic system that's built more on shipbuilding and lumber and fishing and small scale farming. So each of these economies are going to build up on their own. And the colonies are going to become incredibly successful economically. Their economic growth is substantial throughout the 1660s into the 1600s into the 1700s. By 1750, the colonial gross national product is 25 million pounds a year, which is not weight pounds; it's currency pounds. So what the colonies altogether are producing is the equivalent of $2.25 billion today every year. So they've been incredibly successful in building these economies in the colonies. By the 1750s, the colonies account for 1/3 of Great Britain's gross national product. So 1/3 of the wealth that is being produced in the British Empire is coming out of the colonies. So the colonies are incredibly important to Great Britain from an economic standpoint. By 1775, the per person production of economic value is the highest in the world. So the colonies are producing more wealth than anywhere else in the world on a per person basis. Now, a lot of this is really going to be rooted in tobacco and the Southern economy's foundation of cash crops. But all told, the colonies are going to be incredibly successful economically in a way that matters a whole lot to the British government in general. Now, that's economic. The colonies also experience a ton of self-government, right? I told you earlier, the British are like, do you just keep making us a lot of money? So we see the colonies experimenting with self-government via colonial assemblies, things like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which we talked about in the last video, as well as town assemblies that are really rooted in church membership in New England. But the colonies have really been able to govern themselves. That's important. Now, despite that, the colonists they express a ton of pride in being British, in being part of the British Empire. As you all read in class, if you remember, we read an excerpt from a preacher after the French and Indian War who's super excited that the colonists got to participate and exert their pride via action in the French and Indian War. So despite the fact that the colonists are over here doing their own thing, they still are incredibly proud of being part of the British Empire. In the colonies particularly, high life expectancy, people are living longer. We talked about this in the last video as well. And the colonists are much more literate than elsewhere in the world. as much of their news is going to be transmitted via the written word, which is going to play a role later with things like common sense and things like the Federalist Papers. So all of this is going to change because of the French and Indian War. Now, before the war, the North American territorial empires look like this. The British American colonies are here on the Atlantic seaboard, from New England and the middle colonies down to the southern colonies. The British also control much of the middle part of Canada. The Spanish, as we talked about in the last video as well, are going to control Florida into New Orleans, as well as Texas and much of what we now know as Mexico and Central America. And in between all of that is the French. Now, we talked about this in the last video too, and that the French don't have a lot of people there necessarily, or a lot of control there, but the French are using this territory for their fur trade and to expand their economic horizons as well. Now, the French are going to lose the French and Indian War, and the Treaty of Paris 1763 is going to cede or give the land to the British Empire, and then the post-war world looks like this, in which the British have been given all of this land east of the Mississippi River, and that's going to cause incredible pride for the colonies as they look at this and say, look at all this new land that we've fought for, that we've acquired. Now we can spread out, we can open our wings and become even more successful part of this British Empire. Now, with this war, though, the British have acquired a tremendous amount of war debt that they're going to start looking for new means of revenue to pay for. And what's also been exposed is that the colonists in America have become a little bit too independent, too self-sustainable, too self-functioning for the British government's liking. Now, during the war, we see a really important turning point that I want to emphasize during the French and Indian War, and that's called the Albany Plan of Union. Beginning in 1754, at the beginning of the war, this meeting is called between the colonists in America and their Indian allies, in which they're going to plan out how to best conduct this war effort. It's the first time, this is why it matters, it's the first time in which we see the colonists coming together, under the banner of we in America as opposed to Great Britain. All right, it's the first time the colonists meet without the presence of the British crown, and they lay out this grand plan of union, hence the name, the Albany Plan of Union. They're going to elect a grand council in which all the colonies will elect representatives to make decisions for the colonies as a whole. They're going to plan a defense system in which they're going to create what's called mutual self-defense. So they're all going to look out for each other in fighting this war. And they're going to tax all the colonies together to raise money for this war effort. They come up with this Albany Plan of Union. It's going to unite the colonists against their enemies. They send their plans to the colonial assemblies throughout places like Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia and Massachusetts and New York. And they send the plan to Great Britain. And both groups say, no, this is a terrible idea. Great Britain doesn't like the idea because they don't like the colonists beginning to look at themselves as one unit as opposed to just little colonies as part of a broader Great Britain. And the individual colonies don't like it either because they hate the idea, this matters later, they hate the idea of a central power in other colonies charging them with a tax. So both groups shut down the idea. It goes nowhere. But the significance here is that this idea is planted. These seeds are planted in which the colonies can come together under one banner as opposed to just being little satellite outlets of the British Empire. They come up with this awesome cartoons, very famous, Join or Die. With the snake, of course, it's drawn by the man largely responsible for the Albany Plan, who's Benjamin Franklin, in which he argues with this cartoon, as you can see, that unless we all come together under one unit, we will die separately. So the Albany Plan goes nowhere, but it plants some really important seeds that the colonies can come together under one roof, under one banner, when appropriate. Now, after the war, the British are going to change their policy pretty drastically in a couple of different ways. So what happens right after the war, I'll go back to this map. Here. What happens after the war is the colonists are going to flood into this new territory that has been acquired by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, particularly the Ohio River Valley. They're going to flood out there. It's new territory that's accessible. They're good to go. The colonies, as you guys know from the last video, have become much more populated with people, and they're going to spread out to the Ohio River Valley to enjoy this new territory that has been won via the French and Indian War. Now, who's that going to upset? It's going to really upset the Native Americans who were there. Keeping in mind that before the British acquired this land, the nation that had territorial claims to this land is the French. And the French and the natives have very positive relations that are mutually beneficial for both sides. Now it's the British, the French are gone. But now it's not just that someone's there gathering some beaver furs, but there's actual colonists spreading out in great numbers, and that's going to make the Native Americans quite upset. The Native Americans' response to this expansion is going to be Pontiac's Rebellion. Super important turning point, in which Chief Pontiac is going to lead a coordinated response attack on many colonist settlements that are out on the frontier, out in the Ohio River Valley. They're going to burn British forts. They're going to burn British colonist settlements. The Native American response is violent and aggressive and quick. And it's Pontiac's Rebellion that causes colonists to retreat back towards the Atlantic seaboard where things are safer. But it also causes the British government to really formally end the policy of salutary neglect, because it's Pontiac's Rebellion that causes Parliament in Great Britain to pass the Proclamation Act of 1763. And this act, it's the first real attempt to limit colonial expansion. And what it basically says is there's a line. The line is on the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists, you are not to expand past that line. Now, this act itself gets ignored by many colonists. Many colonists are like, cool, stop me. You're way across the Atlantic Ocean. I'm here. I'm going to go across this line. What are you going to do about it? But it demonstrates the beginning of the end for the happy, mutually independent relationship between the British and the colonists. The Proclamation Act of 1763 is passed to try to do two things, right? To keep the colonists safe from Native American violence out on the frontier in the Ohio River Valley, but it's also meant to keep the colonists closer to the Atlantic seaboard, where the British think they can have more control over them using their navy. The British realize that the farther the colonists spread inland, the harder it will be to control them from Great Britain. So this policy, the Proclamation Act, is twofold. Now, that's not the only thing that changes after the French and Indian War. The British are also in a ton of war debt after decades of fighting wars all over the world against France. And they begin looking to the colonists as a new way to gain revenue. The first thing they're going to do is pass the Sugar Act in 1764, which is moderately important in that it's first. The colonists are like, we don't like that. Don't do that. And the British government says, all right, fine, never mind. And they cancel that legislation. 1 year later, they passed the Stamp Act, which is monumentally important. It's the first direct tax on the colonists, in which all published paper goods they need to buy have to have a special tax that you pay a stamp, have to have a stamp that you pay a special tax for that goes to the British government. And it is the Stamp Act that causes the famous phrase, no taxation without representation, from a colonist named James Otis. And what that phrase is very adds good insight to this whole conversation, because the argument there is that, like, if we don't have somebody representing us in Parliament, then therefore Parliament has no authority to tax us directly. The idea is that colonists have no problem paying taxes to their local assemblies, to their local governments, because they have representation there. It's that Parliament is charging us a tax from England without giving us any say or any recourse in the conversation. And because they don't represent us directly, then therefore they don't have any authority to tax us. The British response, of course, is, well, you don't need to have actual representation in Parliament because you have virtual representation. The Parliament passes policies that benefit the entire empire, whether or not we represent you directly. And that divide over what real representation matters is going to manifest itself in the Revolutionary War, as well as debates about how we should establish representation even after the Revolutionary War. It is the Stamp Act that causes the creation of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, to actively, outwardly protest the stamp, to intimidate the tax collectors, to organize their response and their resistance in a way that's meaningful and a significant turning point. And it is the Stamp Act that causes the Stamp Act Congress, this meeting that comes together to represent the colonies as a whole. 9 out of the 13 colonies send representatives. It's a big deal. It's more than half. 9 out of 13 is a super majority. 9 out of 13 colonies, they send representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. They're going to print out some resolutions that are in protest of the act. They're going to send that to Parliament in Great Britain, and Parliament's going to say, you know what? Cool. Never mind. Stamp Act, that's canceled, that's repealed, that's vetoed as well. So at this point, there's been a couple acts, and the colonists have either ignored them, like the Proclamation Act, or protested them and gotten them repealed, like the Sugar and Stamp Act. So it looks like the colonists' response, their reaction to these taxes of protest and being upset and getting them canceled, is being successful. It is 1 year later, however, that Parliament passes the Declaratory Act, which is important. The Declaratory Act is not it does not tax anything. It doesn't create a new revenue source at all. It's just basically a reminder to the colonists that because we are Parliament, we have the right to pass any tax, any law whatsoever, because we have the authority because we're Parliament. So all it is basically, the way I put it is like, the first round is over. Yes, colonists, you've won this first round. You've got our things repealed. But before we start the next round of things, let us just sit here and remind you that we can pass whatever taxes we want because we are Parliament, and that's the authority that's been given to us by the British government. So it's just a little reminder or a supposed frame shifter for the colonists that we can still, yes, we've repealed the first couple, but we're not going anywhere. A year later, Parliament backs this up by passing the Townshend Acts in 1767, which are a tax, again, on printed goods and a variety of tangible items in the colonies, in which the revenue from those taxes are going directly to pay for the new royal officials, the royal governors, the royal tax collectors, the royal military commanders that are in the colonies. So now the colonists are paying a tax that's paying for somebody to be there to control them. So this is when the colonies are like, wait, we didn't ask for these people to be here, so why are we having to pay a tax to pay for them to be here? We don't want them here in the first place. Now, 1770 sees an escalation of colonial and British actions and reactions. By the 1770s, the Quartering Act has been passed, in which the British are leaving military presence in the colonies at the colonist expense. This troop presence increases tension on both sides. 1770s sees our very famous Boston Massacre, in which it's the first example of bloodshed for the colonists at the British military hand. It has this famous engraving that is done by Paul Revere, of course, more on him later, in which it shows these poor colonists who are just being fired on innocently by this angry mob of British soldiers, the direction of their leader, of their captain, and these people are just here minding their own business. Of course, there's the dog. The poor dog might get shot. It's terrible. People are dying. This example of the Boston Massacre is used by those Sons of Liberty and those who are more excited about independence and freedom to try to mobilize response by the colonists against the British. Of course, this engraving is incredibly inaccurate. The British soldiers don't fire on the crowd until they've been hit with rocks and assaulted and verbally impinged on all these things. So, but again, this demonstrates the growing action and reaction and increasing tension between the two sides. Things calm down for a couple years. Until 1773, when Parliament passes the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act, I'm not going to spend too much time on, but it's important to know. The big problem with the Tea Act isn't that it would raise taxes on the colonists. The opposite is true. Actually, it would lower the cost of tea in the colonies. The problem is that it would give basically a monopoly to the British Tea Company. And that makes the colonists very upset because they have a thriving commerce industry of domestic sellers of tea. And again, it just demonstrates the fact that it's not necessarily the taxes that the colonists are mad about. It's the control and the lack of a voice, the lack of representation that they're upset about. The Tea Act, I put for this slide, I think it's helpful. I put the British action in regular font and the colonists' reaction in italicized font. So the British are going to pass the Tea Act. The colonists are going to respond, the Sons of Liberty in particular, are going to respond with the Boston Tea Party, in which they're going to go on to the ships in Boston Harbor, dump all the tea into the ocean in protest of the Tea Act. That's going to make the British government incredibly angry, as millions of dollars worth of tea is just now floating in the Atlantic Ocean. So Parliament will respond with the coercive acts, which are what they're called officially in Parliament, or the intolerable acts is what the colonists call them. Coercive, to coerce means to convince, to shift somebody's opinion with a little bit of force, which is why the British would call it that. And intolerable, of course, means cannot be handled, unfair, unjust. So we see like even the way the two sides are looking at this set of acts, demonstrating the different ways they're viewing this conflict. Now, the intolerable acts are going to be really, really important. They're going to shut down Boston Harbor until the money for the tea is paid back. They're also going to shut down Massachusetts colonial assemblies, a way in which their democracy is formed, which is going to be very, very offensive to many of the colonists. They're going to increase the British troop presence there in New England until the colonists learn their lesson. And the reaction here to the intolerable acts by the colonists is the First Continental Congress, which is important. The First Continental Congress is a meeting in which 12 of the 13 colonies send a representative. So we're seeing an escalation in how many colonies are down to like send their people to make these decisions, to have these conversations. The First Continental Congress is going to protest the intolerable acts, but they're going to serve as really a coordinated response by the colonies to these things. 2 years later, the British government is going to send troops to try to seize arms, to seize what's been stored by the colonies in Lexington and Concord. And it's here where Paul Revere makes his second important appearance of this short video, in which he warns the colonists that the British are coming, the Redcoats are coming. They're able to move these weapons, but the British army is going to kill people. Some British soldiers will be killed. And really, it's Lexington and Concord that is seen as the launch point of the Revolutionary War, because it's the first formal conflict between the militia of the colonies and the British army as well. It is Lexington and Concord that gives us our Second Continental Congress, in which all 13 colonies send a representative. And this Second Continental Congress is going to be incredibly important in the next few years, as they serve, as I put on the slide, as a unofficial national government that has no real legitimacy, but they're going to function like a national government during and then shortly after the Revolutionary War. The Second Continental Congress is going to be, they're going to send an olive branch petition to King George, in which they say to King George, if you go back to the way things were, we'll go back to the way things were. All you got to do is stop taxing us, get rid of these things, and we'll go back to this mutually beneficial relationship. King George says, go to hell, screw you. And that's what leads us to 1775, in which the British issue their proclamation of rebellion, which basically says, we will not negotiate with these colonies, the colonists, until they stop this rebellion. And 1 year later, out of the Second Continental Congress comes the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson with help from Ben Franklin and others. This Declaration of Independence is going to lay out all the reasons why the American colonists are now going to be independent from Great Britain. So we see from 1763 to 1776, in this 13-year window, gradual escalation in action by the British and gradual escalation in reaction to these actions by the colonists. That's going to eventually then lead to a point in 1776 in which there's no coming back from declaring independence. Of course, this famous picture in New York is this toppling of King George's statue. We see, I think this picture is interesting and intriguing because we see a variety of social classes, genders, and races participating here in this toppling of the statue, while this British government here in his red coat, British official, is trying to stop them from doing so. But this picture really demonstrates this attempt by the colonists to portray the American Revolution as interclass, intergender, interracial attempt at social upheaval, at social change. So that's how we get to the revolution. What does the revolution argue? The revolution argues that the colonists have their right to be independent because of a couple things. Thing one, Enlightenment ideals. We talked about this in the last video as well. The Enlightenment really turns the ideas of government on their head, in which it's going to really put four key issues in people's minds about what government is supposed to be. The first is republicanism. Republicanism is this idea that people, the best way to govern is to give people representatives who represent them, make decisions on their behalf, and that people have a right to pick who represents them in government. Republicanism really we attribute to John Locke and others in the Enlightenment, but it throws this idea that people should pick their government, people should pick their rulers, people should pick their representatives, because it overthrows this idea of the divine right of kings that says God picked the rulers. So republicanism is foundational here. That's the argument that the colonists are making about taxation without representation, is that unless you give us representation, then you don't have any right to rule us, to control us. The second is natural rights. As Locke lays out, the rights to life, right to liberty, right to property, and that the government should be there to protect those rights. And when the government's not protecting those rights, then it's our duty as citizens to overthrow that government. The third Enlightenment ideal that really plays an ideological foundation here is the separation of powers, which we attribute to Montesquieu. Separation of powers, basically it's in the title, that no one person or no one group should have all of the power over any system of government. That in order to most fairly govern people, you need to distribute these powers across multiple groups or individuals, in which those groups can check each other. And that's the best way to keep government from becoming too powerful. And the fourth is really important as well, the social contract. And the social contract idea is going to come from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And it's going to argue that the government is a two-way street, right? That it's not just the government telling us what to do, but we enter into a social contract with our government in which we give up some of our rights as people in exchange for the protection and the fair governance by our government. When the government's not holding up their end of the bargain, then it's our duty to overthrow that government and put in place a more fair one that will hold up their end of the contract. Those are the ideological roots of the American Revolution. We also see some economic roots. Because of salutary neglect, we see a really thriving colonial economy, and they feel by the 1770s like maybe they don't need to be operating in this British mercantilistic system anymore, and would be better off leaving the British system and embracing independence and being able to trade with everybody around the world. So there's these varying foundations of the American Revolution. The Enlightenment ideals are very important. The colonial economy is very important as well. And all of that ends up being summed up really nicely by Thomas Paine, as he publishes in the 1770s a very influential book called Common Sense. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the colonists are incredibly literate in comparison to the rest of the world. Common Sense is written at a very understandable reading level with language that people from all social classes can embrace. And Common Sense is going to lay out all those arguments, but the political arguments for independence, the economic arguments for independence, the social and the logical and even the scientific arguments for independence. Right? It's going to argue that like the moon rotates around the Earth because the moon's smaller than the Earth. We're bigger than Great Britain. Why are we rotating around Great Britain like we're a moon to their Earth? So it's going to lay out all kinds of arguments for independence. Very influential book. It's going to change a lot of minds. It's a bestseller. Many colonists are going to read Common Sense, and it's going to change a lot of minds towards independence. So the war goes. Couple important things to know about the war itself. Things that should be in the back of your minds as well. French support is incredibly important in winning this war, in which they're going to happily join the U.S. effort because they hate Great Britain as well. And they're going to be involved after the Battle of Saratoga in helping the colonist cause. George Washington's leadership is also important, mentioned in the College of War framework as things to know on the Continental Army. And really, the Revolutionary War is less so won than it is just not lost. The colonies are going to hang on long enough until the British just get tired of carrying out this war, and then they're going to leave, leaving the colonists independent. So the first outcome that you need to know of the American Revolution is independence. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, is signed by both groups, all three groups if you include the French, which grants the Americans independence. It grants the Americans land out to the Mississippi, that whole chunk of land that the British tried to restrict the colonies from spreading out to via the Proclamation Act. It's all now American territory, and the country is free of British tyranny, free of British control. We're all independent. Life is good. What comes next? Also important to note what society comes out as the first outcome, independence. Second outcome is this revolutionary era society, in which our country is going to really invest in the idea of republicanism, in which people get to pick their representatives, pick their rulers, so to speak. Society in this revolutionary era society is going to be much more merit-based than it is aristocratic. We see in the American colonies much more self-made leadership than elsewhere in the world, in which a lot of the power players, those in power, are there because of their own efforts, their own progress, the only things they've invested in. People like Alexander Hamilton, right, who's a very self-made man. However, kind of a counterpoint to this revolutionary society is that the wealth in I can't call them colonies anymore, they're independent. The wealth in the newly created United States is very unequally distributed. At the top, for women, this revolutionary society is going to introduce this idea of Republican motherhood. Cool content to have in the back of your head. Abigail Adams writing to John Adams as he's serving in the Second Continental Congress, saying, "Yeah, as you guys are all debating your things and creating your new country, don't forget to remember the ladies. We're here to support this as well." And the way in which the ladies are remembered is Republican motherhood. This idea that women's role should be to embrace raising up and training the next generation of Republican leaders. It's going to increase women's importance in political culture and give them a very important role in political culture without actually giving them any real responsibility, any real action in political culture. Another very important outcome of the American Revolution is the abolition of slavery in the northern states. Every state, New York, Pennsylvania, New York, North, is going to outlaw slavery either immediately or gradually over time during and after the Revolutionary War to make an attempt to reflect these ideals of revolution in their society. The South, however, is not going to do that. The South is by this point is much more reliant on slavery, much more reliant on cash crop agriculture, much more heavily slave demographically, and that's going to lead the South to not outlaw slavery, and instead that will cause us, as you all know, many, many problems later. Another important outcome of the American Revolution are the state constitutions. Each state is told, write a constitution in which you put on paper the things that your state government believes in. And in these state constitutions, we see really important things like liberal democracy, like the protection of freedom of speech, like government being limited on what they can take away. So these state constitutions really become the foundation for the American political discussion that turns into the Constitution. So it's important to note that each state is really putting on paper what it is they believe in as an outcome of the American Revolution. So after the war, the real fear by those in the newly created country, their big fear is tyranny. Their big fear is too much power in the hands of a central government. So what they create is a system in which states have the power over their states, and the national government is incredibly limited in what it can do, what it can carry out, what it can force citizens and states to do. So the states are going to draft their new constitutions, very important. The states are going to really define very clearly what the citizens' rights are. It's here where we'll see a lot of the stuff that ends up in the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom to protest, all these things. We're going to see two different kinds of state constitutions, though. The more conservative state constitutions are going to put less hands in the power of the legislature with things like bicameral legislatures. So there's a little bit of a check within the legislative branch, and stronger governors. They're going to put things like property requirements to vote so that they're a little less liberal, a little less power to the people, so to speak. States like Massachusetts and New York and Virginia are going to be good examples of that. But other states are going to put almost the entire power of their country, of their state, in the hands of the people via the legislative branch. States with unicameral legislatures, one house legislatures, in which there's no check within the legislative branch on itself, and much weaker governors, states that exhibit universal manhood suffrage, which is important as a stepping stone towards a more liberal democracy. States like New Jersey, New Hampshire will embrace those liberal type of state constitutions. But it's important to understand like that this debate, all of this is part of this broader debate about republicanism, about democracy, about the role of government. There's these two philosophies that play a hand in this conversation. Republicanism is this idea that power should be in the hands of those that have the ability to make decisions. So yes, we can all vote together, but we should be voting to let people make decisions that know best, right? That republicanism is one step above democracy. Democracy is power to all the hands of people with a mob rule. It's too chaotic. It's too messy. Republicanism, which we pick qualified people to go represent us, is a much more sophisticated way of governance in their minds. That democracy is synonymous with mob rule and development of factions. So that debate plays a role, right, in which the liberal state constitutions are a little more democratic and the conservative state constitutions are a little more republicanism based. And we also see debates on who can vote. Is voting a white thing across the board? Should we put a property requirement in place? Should all males be able to vote? Should we let women vote? Should they be church members, right, in places like New England that are more heavily influenced by religion? So all these debates play a role in what comes out, which is American political culture going forward. Now, the articles themselves, the government that's going to run the country in the next 6-7-ish years, the Articles of Confederation are a weak central government, but I want to emphasize to you that they are an intentionally weak central government. They're weak on purpose because the real goal here is to leave power in the hands of the states, to protect state power. Most Americans at this time identify themselves much more with their state than they do with the country as a whole, right? People are much more likely to say, I'm a Virginian, I'm a New Englander, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a South Carolinian. Then they're going to say, I'm an American. So people trust their state governments because it feels closer. It feels more attached to them. People have much less trust for a farther away federal government because the concern there is that will lead them to tyranny like it did with Great Britain. It's a confederation-style government, so every state gets one vote in a unicameral Congress, meaning it's just one house, one legislative house in a one-branch government in which every state gets one vote. There's no president. There's no national judiciary to settle disputes legally. And the only powers that are granted formally to the federal government via the Articles of Confederation are to settle disputes between states, to negotiate treaties with other countries, to handle Indian affairs, and to oversee a military. Now, the Articles can't really do any of these things because they don't have any power to raise funds that would be required to do things like see a military or fight off Indians and the like. What the Articles of Confederation, the national government can't do, can't tax citizens, can't tax states. It can only request or ask for contributions from the states. Couldn't tax or regulate trade between the states. So we see states putting tariffs on each other, trying to raise funds for each individual state. At one point, Massachusetts has a higher tax on the state next to it than it does on things coming in from Great Britain. The Articles cannot create a common currency, so we have each individual state printing their own type of money, which leads then to problems with exchange across state lines. All of these things are going to lead to a very inefficient federal government. And the last two pieces are going to make it a very inefficient national government that's very hard to change. Any new law would be required to get approval from 9 out of 13 states, a supermajority. So in order to pass anything new, legislatively, politically, you need to get 9 states on board, which is incredibly challenging given the fact that each state, as we already talked about in the previous video, has its own real economic system, its own different social system, its own different political system. So it's going to be very challenging to get nine states on board with these differences. And any change to the actual system of the Articles would require unanimous consent across all 13 states. Again, virtually impossible to do. Given what we know about the various backgrounds and understandings of all 13 states. So it's a very weak national government, but I want to emphasize that it's weak on purpose. It's intentionally weak. Now, each state is looked at like its own little pseudo-nation, its own little, each state is treated like its own country within a broader arrangement of countries. And there's no national president because it's too similar to a monarch. There's this fear that if we give one person power, it's going to be like King George all over again. Now, there are two successes that are worth noting under the Articles of Confederation. This is good, helpful background information for a lot of things. First is the Land Ordinance of 1785, which is going to sell land that the government owns in the Northwest Territory, modern-day Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan. The Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to sell land to raise funds for the government, since the government has no other way to make money because the government can't tax. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to be good because it establishes this precedent of the federal government using land sales to generate revenue. It's going to be a big driver of federal government revenue for the next 80 to 100 years. And the second success is a much more significant success. It's the Northwest Ordinances of 1787. Again, still dealing with the same territory, the Northwest Territory. And what this is going to do is it's going to establish a very orderly process for becoming a state. It's going to basically say once your settlement has this many people, it can become a county. Once your area has this many counties, then it can apply to become a state. And when it applies to become a state, it will get all the rights, all the privileges that every other state gets. So all these new states that we're going to add to our country on the western frontier are going to be treated the exact same as all of our existing states. Meaning you're going to get 2 senators. That's a later thing. You're going to get all your House of Representatives members. You're going to get protection from the federal government. That when we're spreading out, we're not spreading out to create colonies. We're spreading out to create equal states. It's a big deal. Also, the Northwest Ordinance is going to guarantee that slavery will not expand to the Northwest Territory. So it becomes the first place in which the federal government actually outlaws the expansion of slavery. Big deal. Some ask, why would the South, knowing we need 9 out of 13 states to agree, why would the South agree to not allowing slavery to spread? Why is that the South looks at their own expansion into the South West in places like Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, and they say we don't need to worry about spreading slavery there because there's plenty of territory to spread slavery here. So those are the 2 successes. I guess that's it. From a shortcoming standpoint, there's 3 really big things and 1 important outcome. The biggest shortcoming is economic. The country is in shambles economically. The national debt is incredibly high. Inflation is sky high because of war spending and war printing of currency. We see a ton of state-to-state economic competition in which states are competing with each other, which does not help a national economy become successful. And there's not really a whole lot that the Articles of Confederation government can do about it because they don't have the power or the authority to do a lot of these things that would be required to fix the economy. So the economy is terrible. The balance of trade is terrible, in which America is still buying way more stuff from other countries, particularly Britain, than we are selling. What that means is that when we're buying more than we're selling out, that creates this perpetual debt situation. British goods are cheaper because they've obviously industrialized long before the Americans have, because of mercantilism. And England's going to say, cool, you wanted to be free and independent. Now you're free and independent. But guess what? You can't trade with our Caribbean colonies. You can't sell stuff to them. So because of mercantilism, we're going to keep them in our empire. So good luck. And that's going to really hurt the U.S. balance of trade as well. The third real weakness is on foreign policy. The U.S. has very little strength to exert on the foreign policy stage. And what that's going to lead to is the British refusing to take their troops out of the Ohio River Valley. Because the U.S. still has not paid back their war debt. So the British are like, cool, we're going to just kind of stay here and hang out. And America says, well, you have to leave. And they're going to say, make us. And America's going to say, well, we can't because we're poor and we have no real army. So that's going to demonstrate foreign policy weakness. And the Spanish as well are going to close off access to the Mississippi River, which then hurts the U.S. ability to on the western frontier produce goods, ship them down the river, and get them out to the broader world as a whole. So economically, it's a mess. Balance of trade wise, it's a mess. Foreign policy wise, the government's a mess. And a lot of this is going to lead to Shays' Rebellion, which is a rebellion of farmers on the Massachusetts frontier who are Revolutionary War veterans who are upset that they're being charged taxes and they can't pay them and they're losing their farms and the like. Shays' Rebellion is monumentally important because it demonstrates that the national government and the Articles of Confederation is very weak and has no power to put down this turmoil. Everybody's like, who's going to stop these rebels? Call the army. And what army? Well, let's draft an army. We can't do that. Well, Can we like pay some? No, can't do that either. So it's going to demonstrate to the leaders in the United States that their government is not strong enough to respond to these crises, and that's going to lead to first the Annapolis Convention, which is an important meeting that's not very well attended, but it sets the stage for the Constitutional Convention to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and put in place a much stronger national government who can respond to long-term struggles like economic depression, but also short-term crises like Shays' Rebellion. So the Constitution is debated and negotiated in Philadelphia in the late 1780s. There's a couple issues that I'll talk to you about that are in the Constitution that you should know. The first is representation. I told you a couple minutes ago that the foundation of a lot of these debates is republicanism, is how do people get represented in the government. In this case, we have two proposals, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan is going to be the big state proposal. It's going to the proposal is going to be one that would benefit the states that have bigger populations. The Virginia Plan is going to call for a much stronger central government. It's proposed by James Madison, who we give a lot of credit for a lot of these writings of the Constitution to. A stronger central government that has a bicameral legislature. So a legislative branch that has two houses. Right? Bi means two, cameral meaning bodies. So a bicameral legislature in which both legislatures, the number of people serving on them from the states will be based on the state's population. So it's population based. So the states that have more people have more representation in Congress. Those legislative bodies will then, we're going to vote for those people. Again, that benefits the big states because they have more people that are then voting. And then that legislative body, they'll pick the executive branch and they'll pick the judiciary branch. So really all the power is in the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is entirely based on population. So of course the big states would propose this because this benefits the big states. It gives them a bigger say in the legislative branch, and then because of that, a bigger say in the executive and the judiciary branch. And the argument for it is that we have more people, so therefore we should have more say. Reasonable. The contrary plan, the opposite plan, is the New Jersey Plan, proposed to benefit the smaller states. And the New Jersey Plan is going to look a lot like a modified version of the Articles of Confederation. A much weaker central government, a little stronger than the Articles have, but not a whole lot stronger. A weaker central government, and still having one legislative body, a unicameral legislature with one vote per state. Of course, the smaller states would prefer this because it leaves them on equal ground, equal footing with the rest of the states that have more people. But the New Jersey Plan does make some concessions and say, like, yeah, we should probably have a president to execute the law. We should probably have a national judiciary to interpret the law. So it is a step up from the Articles, but not as far of a step up as is the Virginia Plan. The solution found by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, which is why it's called the Connecticut or the Great Compromise, is really just to combine the two plans into one. Why don't we keep the idea of a bicameral legislature from the Virginia Plan? And in the House of Representatives, the lower house, we'll make that population-based, in which the more people you have in your state, the more votes you get. The Senate, the upper house, why don't we make that equality-based, in which there's 2 senators per state, no matter how many people your state has, and those people will be elected by the state legislatures, not by the people of the states. So it's a little bit of a buffer against mob rule democracy. So the Connecticut or Great Compromise does a good job of combining both ideas to a compromise plan that makes both sides feel like they could be okay with it. Now, once that's out of the way, Congress has the power to tax. That's a big deal. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's a big deal. So they're going to do things like outlaw states taxing each other on purchases. They're going to have the power to regulate international commerce, which is important. And monumentally important is Congress will have the power to exert federal supremacy over states via the Supremacy Clause, which says that whatever Congress does, like, that's the law of the land, and states don't have the right to violate that. So it's going to really reinforce this idea that with this new Constitution, we are not a states' rights only type of government anymore, but now whatever Congress does, we have much more of a national type of policy. 2 more compromises worth noting that both deal with slavery. The first is the 3/5 Compromise, very, very famous and well known, in which slaves in the South are going to count for 3/5 of a person for representation reasons, because as we just talked about, your population matters a whole lot for representation in the House of Reps. So now slaves will count as 3/5 of a person for representation and 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes. The South comes out on top on this one because it gives the South more influence, more votes in the House of Representatives, which gives the South then more votes later in the Electoral College to decide the president. It's pretty important that as the slave population in the South grows, so too with it does the South's political power in this whole equation, this whole conversation. The second is a slave trade compromise. The South doesn't like the idea of giving the national government the power to regulate interstate commerce because their fear is that they're going to ban the trading of slaves. So the compromise here is that Congress won't touch the slave trade, the importation of slaves from Africa or the Caribbean for 20 years. In exchange, the South agrees to allow Congress the power to regulate commerce. So the Constitution is often seen as a bundle of compromises. I think that's a pretty fair assessment of what the Constitution is, as it takes a variety of compromises to put everybody on a page in which they can agree with this new form of government. So the Constitution is done. That does not yet make it the rule of the land. It still has to be ratified by the states via state ratification conventions. It's going to go to the states. The states are going to have their own meetings. They're going to vote as states on whether or not they approve of the Constitution. And this fight for ratification, this fight to approve or not approve of the Constitution is going to lead to two really important factions, not political parties, factions. The first is the Federalists. They're going to be the ones who are in favor of the new Constitution. They'll be pro-Constitution. These Federalists are in favor of a strong central government that operates for the common good. The Federalists are going to be very well funded and very politically organized because a lot of them are the ones who wrote the Constitution, so they can be the best at selling the Constitution because they had a hand in writing it. The Federalists are best defined by 2 to 3 individuals, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Those 3 individuals are going to write the Federalist Papers, which are going to be published in New York specifically as an attempt to get people on board with the new U.S. Constitution. The Federalist Papers are incredibly important in giving us, as students of history, insight into the ways in which those that wrote the Constitution thought it would be put into practice, put into play in society. Fed 10 is important because it argues that the best way to control for different factions and different violent parts of society is to have a big, strong, diverse republic that has the power to then control these things. Fed 51 is one of my favorites because it gives a phenomenal line that I think helps us get our mind around why the Constitution is what it is, which says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, which is true. And if angels were to govern men, we wouldn't need to control the government. However, that's not the way it works because our government is administered by men over men. There's no angels involved here. The biggest difficulty lies in this. First, you must enable the government to control the governed. You need to give the government enough power to control the people it's governing. But you next need to give the government the power to control itself. So it's this balance, this dynamic of how do you give the government enough power to control society, to create stability, but then also not give it so much power that it can take over and exert too much authority. How do you get the government to control the people and also check the government itself? And that's really the balance that the Constitution strives to attain. The anti-federalists are going to disagree. They're going to say, like, this is not the country we signed up for. This is not the society that we fought a Revolutionary War for. We don't want a strong central government because it's going to lead to tyranny and oppression. They're going to argue instead for more states' rights. Their big argument is going to be that, yes, this government's too powerful, too important, but the bigger problem is that no Bill of Rights is included. We don't ever lay out what can't the government do, what rights are guaranteed for the people, and without a Bill of Rights, they're not going to be on board with this new Constitution. The Federalists can be much more urban merchants, the industrial upper class. The anti-Federalists can be much more the small farmers, Western homesteaders, the yeomanry, the Southern non-plantation owners. They're going to be really backed by people like George Mason and Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, who, of course, earlier, as we talked about, says famously, "Give me liberty or give me death." And the anti-federalists are going to argue that more freedom from a smaller central government is what we fought for in the Revolutionary War. The anti-federalists are going to publish their own set of papers as well. I like the quote. It says, "I'd rather be a free citizen of the free small republic of Massachusetts than an oppressed subject of the great American empire." Again, reflecting this idea that that people in the anti-federalist side of things are much more in favor of small, localized government without a strong federal government that is could be seen as oppressive. Now, the solution, again, the final compromise, if you will, of the Constitution is the Federalist Promise. If you guys agree, just ratify this bad boy. Let's approve this and move on. Then we'll add the Bill of Rights later. It's ratified June 21st of 1788. It's important to look at this as the Second American Revolution. Of course, the war, the work towards independence was first. The next big revolution is how to govern. The Second American Revolution is complete with the ratification of the Constitution. Virginia and New York are the 10th and 11th states to ratify, which means that technically speaking, we only needed 9 states on board. But Virginia and New York are our 2 most important states, population-wise and economic-wise. So without those 2 on board, the Constitution would have likely failed. So getting Virginia and New York to ratify was very important towards long-term stability of the Constitution. Rhode Island is last, the freaking sewer. Of course, they're last. And shortly after, the Bill of Rights is added, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It's the only time we've ever added multiple amendments at one time like this. The First Amendment is important because it does all those important free speech things. The Establishment Clause, meaning that Congress can't create a national religion. Congress can't regulate our ability to express ourselves, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, all those things. The Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments are important in that they guarantee rights of the accused, those who are accused of crimes, from unreasonable search and seizure, that all people in America get due process of the law, be charged with a crime in order to be put in jail and the like. And then the 10th Amendment is important as well to our conversation because it says that all powers not expressly given to the federal government via the Constitution, if the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do that, then that power belongs to the states. So that's going to lead to some conflict later because that's going to kind of run counter to what the Elastic Clause says, which is that all powers, Congress has all powers to do what's necessary and proper for the carrying out of its duties. So again, that's going to lead to these discussions about constitutional interpretation and what should be a federal government power, what should be a state power, and it's going to cause some conflict there as well. Again, this demonstrates this idea that as soon as we got Delaware on board, Pennsylvania on board, New Jersey on board, Georgia on board, Connecticut on board, Massachusetts on board, Maryland on board, South Carolina on board, New Hampshire on board, and then once we get Virginia and New York on board, then the foundation of our country is good enough that it can be saved even without the other 2 states that may disagree. So it's really just emphasizing this idea that really you need Virginia and New York on board to keep things strong enough to move forward, which happens. So first thing that's important to know, post-Constitution, is Washington is elected as the first president. He's elected unanimously. He tabs John Adams as his vice president, Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as his Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as his Attorney General, which is really America's chief lawyer, if you will. Congress, one of the first things Congress does when elected, the first Congress, is they pass the Judiciary Act of 1789, which says, yes, the Constitution creates the Supreme Court. The Judiciary Act is going to lay out all the other federal courts below that to create a much more stable federal court system for our judiciary. Within the Washington administration, we see some foreign policy problems. First amongst them is the French Revolution, in which the French overthrow their government in an extremely bloody and violent way upon inspiration from us. Thomas Jefferson is going to want to support the French as he is a lover of liberty. And others are going to argue that we should support the French because the French supported us in our revolution. Very importantly, Washington's going to issue the Proclamation of Neutrality, which is going to say that, no, that's not our problem. Our policy is going to be to stay neutral, to mind our own business, and to hang out over here in America, not worrying about European problems. We signed 2 really important treaties with other countries during the Washington administration. First is Jay's Treaty with Great Britain, in which we're trying to resolve the unresolved conflicts of the Revolutionary War, impressment of sailors on the high seas, war debt, the presence of British troops on the frontier in the Ohio Valley, Uh, so it's the first. It's supposed to, and it grants favored trade status to Great Britain, which is exciting because it starts to establish this idea of maybe we can be friends with them. That's Jay's Treaty. It's very unpopular in America, but it sets up this idea that America is an equal power with other countries, and we can settle our problems diplomatically. Us signing this treaty with Great Britain is going to frighten Spain into trying to get back on our good side as well. And Spain authorizes the Pinckney Treaty, which grants the U.S. access to the Port of New Orleans. And then with the Port of New Orleans, that means you can use the Mississippi River to get goods in and out of the United States. So our foreign policy is that of neutrality and diplomacy during the Washington administration, which is important. Under Washington's administration as well, we see the creation of Hamilton's financial plan, which is a three-part plan to fix the economy that I'll talk about here just in a moment. And then under Washington's watch, the creation of the first two-party system between who become the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Under Washington's administration, worth noting as well is the Whiskey Rebellion, in which people are going to rebel against Hamilton's whiskey tax, much like they've rebelled against other taxes in the past. The difference here is the federal government is going to exert its authority and put down the rebellion very, very aggressively and quickly, which is going to do two things. Thing one, it's going to demonstrate that the U.S. Constitution is an effective government that can resolve crises and respond to problems in an efficient manner. Thing two, though, is going to cause a lot of people like Jefferson to argue that the use of the U.S. government to stop rebellion, protest, all these things is inappropriate and looks like tyranny. Washington steps aside after 2 terms, after 8 years as president, setting up this precedent that president should only serve 2 terms max. Of course, every president is going to follow that precedent until FDR because of World War II and the Great Depression. And he also issues a very important farewell address, also setting the precedent that every president afterwards will give a farewell address at the end of his presidency. Lincoln doesn't, however. And in his farewell address, he warns against political parties. He warns against sectionalism. He warns against the U.S. getting involved in European problems. He gives some advice to America that matters a whole lot going forward. So there's a couple of divisive issues that are going to lead us to our first 2-party system. The first is Hamilton's financial plans. The country has a ton of debt, as we already talked about. The states themselves have a ton of debt as well. So the first proposal he has is the federal government should assume or take over those state debts and then pay them off, which does a couple things. It allows the states to not have these debts anymore. But to states in the South that have already paid off their debts, they see this as, again, another example of the federal government exerting too much authority over the states. But then also within his financial plan is the creation of a national bank, which is going to alarm some people. Hamilton's argument is that the bank is necessary and proper, and therefore it should be allowed under the Elastic Clause to be created by Congress. Washington ends up agreeing with him. Congress agrees. The national bank is created. And then to raise money for the country, to raise these funds to pay off the debt, to create economic stability, he's going to put in place a tariff, which is an import tax on manufactured goods, which is going to encourage the U.S. to begin industrializing itself because foreign goods are more expensive. And also a whiskey tax, a tax on whiskey, an excise tax on whiskey, which is going to lead then, as we talked about, to the Whiskey Rebellion, which demonstrates a stronger federal government response, makes Jefferson really mad. And we're going to really see the South be very resistant to Hamilton's financial plans because they're seen as pro-industry, pro-industrialization, pro-urban, pro-city, pro-banking, and the South prefers none of those things. There is significant opposition to Hamilton's financial plan, particularly from 2 people, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who really become the founding charter members of the Democratic Republicans in opposition to Hamilton's Federalists. They're going to argue instead for states' rights. Banks should be a state thing, right? We shouldn't be using the federal government to support one type of economy or the other. That should be a state decision. The argument that Hamilton's plans would only benefit the North and urban banking industrial classes. So this financial reasons are going to start to create a divide in society. Foreign policy as well, as I already alluded to earlier. Jefferson's going to be very, very pro-French. We must support our allies in their fight for liberty, whereas Hamilton's going to be more pro-British, as he looks at the British economy as what the U.S. should emulate and should aspire to, and the roadmap to the U.S. economic success. Whereas Washington's going to be pro neither of them, pro neutrality and pro that middle ground in which we just do our own thing, mind our own business, and keep ourselves out of other countries' problems. But it's this Hamilton and Jefferson debate and divide over things like the financial plan, things like the Whiskey Rebellion, things like the French Revolution, things like constitutional interpretation that give us our first two-party system, which is very, very important to note. The Federalists, just like the Federalists during the constitutional era, ratification era, believe in a strong national government, strong central government policies that are passed that encompass the entire nation with loose interpretation. Right? They want to emphasize the elastic clause that their state the argument being that if the Constitution doesn't say we can't do it, then therefore we can, and unless it says no, we can do those things with a looser interpretation of the Constitution. They are supported by the commerce and manufacturing classes, much more seen in urban cities. Largely representative of the rich people, the well-born, the able, the educated, the merchants, the bankers, the industrial class. They're going to be much more pro-British and anti-French Revolution because the French Revolution is seen as this mob rule, which is the opposite of Federalist philosophies. And regionally speaking, they're going to be much more seen in the Northeast, in New England and New York, etc. The Democratic Republicans are going to be basically the opposite of that on every single issue. More in favor of states' rights, with stronger local and state governments with a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Basically what that means is if the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, then you can't, right? And they're going to be much more supported by the agricultural classes, the yeomanry, the rural areas, small farmers, plantation owners, artisans, those that prefer a weaker national government. They're going to be anti-British, much more pro-French Revolution, and seen regionally speaking in the West and the South. So really, it's under Washington's administration and these divides that create this first two-party system. I think the first two-party system and these early debates are ripe for the type of question the College Board might be asking you in your DBQ. So these are things that I would encourage you to spend a little time making sure you're really familiar with, and you can pull a lot of SFI out of those back pockets. Now, 1796 gives us our first real contested election in American political history. John Adams runs against Thomas Jefferson. Of course, Adams was Washington's vice president. Jefferson was his Secretary of State. We see that Adams is running as a Federalist. Jefferson is running as a Democratic Republican. Those names weren't quite concrete and formed yet, but the seeds of the party system are there. The Democratic Republicans are going to accuse Adams of monarchism, of being too in favor of a monarchical type of government and too in favor of central power. The Federalists will respond and accuse Jefferson of condoning the French Revolution's extreme violence against people. It's a very ugly, muddy election, in which case they're throwing all kinds of trash at each other. But look at the map. The map demonstrates this growing regional divide between the two political groups. The coastal areas and the Northeast are going to vote Federalist. The inland or rural areas and the South are going to vote Democratic Republican. Adams wins barely by an electoral share of 51 to 49%. Adams wins barely. In 4 years, they're going to run against each other again, and this time it's going to flip, and Jefferson's going to win. And it demonstrates kind of the changing tide of political philosophy in America. But 1796 gives us the Adams administration. As you can see here, he's a very, very good-looking man with a good head of hair. Really knows how to dress and put himself together. Good-looking dude. Now, the Adams administration is pretty pathetic. There's not a whole lot of important stuff that goes on. There is important stuff, but nothing noteworthy from an accomplishment standpoint. On his watch, we see, very importantly, the XYZ affair. The French are very upset with us because we, as a country, signed Jay's Treaty and have gotten on good relations with the British, and we have not supported their revolution, despite the fact that they supported ours. So the French have started impressing our sailors, taking over our ships, seizing our property, our cargo in the high seas. So the Adams administration sends an envoy to go negotiate the end of this impressment with France. When this envoy gets to France, they are greeted by 3 French officials that are codenamed X, Y, and Z that demand a bribe in order to even talk to the French foreign minister. It's very disrespectful to the United States. It gets leaked to the press. There's a ton of anti-French sentiment in the public. People who are clamoring for war with France over this blatant disrespect via the XYZ affair. It leads to the quasi-war with France, which is like a pretend war that's fought mostly by the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean against French ships. which causes a quick expansion of the Army and Navy here in the 1790s. The Navy at the time, in 1796, when Adams is elected, has 3 ships. So they're going to try to ramp up our military capacity in the event of a war with France. War is avoided. Adams, when asked after his presidency what his proudest accomplishment was as president, he says avoiding war with France. So it's quite the accomplishment. We send a new envoy, a new group to negotiate in France. France has their own problems. By 1800, Napoleon has taken over. We send this new envoy to negotiate the end of impressment. We get on better relations with the French, and it's these better relations with the French that allows the U.S. to purchase Louisiana from Napoleon 3 years later under Jefferson's administration. Now, under Adams' administration, we see a ton of criticism from the Democratic Republicans, a ton of criticism of his carrying out of progress with the French, his foreign policy, his issues. The Federalists in Congress are going to respond to this criticism from Democratic Republicans with 2 really important new laws, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act, referred to together as a bucket of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, what these acts are going to do is they're going to make it a crime to criticize government leaders. They're going to make it much more difficult for new immigrants to become citizens, and because new citizens vote. And they're going to allow for the federal government to deport what are seen as violent or dangerous immigrants. Now, what their goal there is to keep Democratic immigrants who are coming to America from supporting the Democratic Republicans, because we're seeing America become much more immigrant, and with that, much more in supportive of Democratic Republican type of policies. So the Federalists attempt to limit the expansion of the Democratic Republican political influence. This is going to backfire incredibly badly. It leads to the authorship of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which are monumentally important, and the type of text that you might see in a DBQ, in which Jefferson and Madison anonymously argue that states have the authority and the duty to nullify or cancel out, ignore, don't listen to any law passed by the federal government that is unconstitutional. It's going to lay out this foundation that states have this obligation to nullify unconstitutional laws. It's going to lead the Federalists to lose a lot of influence and power and legitimacy and credibility, because it's seen as desperate and unconstitutional and wrong and morally bankrupt. And of course, these acts they end up expiring or going off the books as soon as Adams is out of the White House. That's it for the Adams administration. Not a whole lot else going on. By 1800, we see the same 2 men run against each other. Jefferson against Adams. In this case, Jefferson wins the Electoral College with a couple extra votes from Virginia and New York. Adams loses, and believe it or not, after 1 round of presidents, he is the last Federalist president in the country's history. Their time in power was brief. This Federalist period was a brief 12 years, but the legacy is very important. They strengthened the national government in a very meaningful way with things like banking and regulations. They established a much more solid financial system. The debt assumption plan and the banking system and the tariffs put the U.S. on the path towards economic prosperity. They encouraged American industrial growth. And with American industrial growth would, in theory, according to the Federalist philosophy, would come economic independence. And during the Federalist period, they avoid war with both Britain and France, which is a big deal, despite some public opinions being in favor of war with both at different times, and signed some pretty important key treaties early on with Great Britain, the Jay's Treaty, and Spain, Pinckney's Treaty. So Jefferson takes office in 1800. This election is monumentally important because it demonstrates that the American political system works, in that power can change hands from one party to the other without any violence or bloodshed. But that, of course, ends period 3. And because it ends period 3, it's going to end our video for today. So I hope period 3 was helpful. There's a couple of topics in period 3 that are very important to be able to grapple with DBQ-wise. The first is the road to revolution, how American political opinions changed before 1776. The second is the Constitution and how that comes to be and how that changes American political thought. And the third is of course, those developments that cause divide that lead to our first 2-party system. So know those 3 really well and have all this good SFI moving over to back those up, and it'll be good to go. I'll see you next time for our period 4 video. Thanks, everybody.